What's going on, traders? This is going to be a quick one. Let's get straight into it. So right now we're looking at the NQ 4-hour time frame, and we're pretty overbought. I will say that much. Now that doesn't necessarily mean too much for the NQ, ES, Triple Q, SPY. They can be overbought, oversold for a very long time, but it is something to keep in mind, especially considering where we are. We're still within this rising wedge, and we're pretty close to the top of this rising wedge. Now we go to the daily time frame here, and it's a much clearer picture right here, right? We're pretty much at this daily supply and demand zone. As you guys can see, we formed this daily supply and demand zone back here. We talked about this before, where we had this bearish engulfing candle. We ended up retesting it, and then we broke completely down. And so we could be looking at the same process, and we could still possibly head a bit higher. If we do, I imagine we're going to head towards at least 20,900, somewhere around there. 21,000, more or less, somewhere around that area is what I'm possibly looking at. But I think it's going to be very short lived once if we do get to the top of this area. And what do I mean by that is, remember we always talk about rising wedge patterns and how predictable they are. And usually, if we do just so happen to break out of this rising wedge pattern, I do think it's going to be short lived and we're going to roll back over. It's important to note that um, we do have elections next week, and the fact that we're pumping so fast into elections can only lead me to believe that there's a potential sell off going to happen. We keep making all time highs or newer highs almost every week heading into elections. And so it leaves me skeptical about what's going to happen, at least towards the end of this week, maybe the end of the month, because we're going to start a new month this week as well. And it leaves me skeptical also heading into elections. Now, one or two things can happen where either Apple earnings or one of these major big tech earnings or multiple big tech earnings causes a sell off prior to elections. But if we don't get some type of sellout prior to elections, I do think that elections could be some type of buy the rumor, sell the news type event. Not only that, but we do have Jerome Powell speaking next week as well. So something to really consider, especially just how fast we're moving. Now, what's important to note here is that we talk about this all the time. When the market makes huge moves in one day, and we made a massive move today, typically what happens the next day, you get some type of cool off period. And we do have like Meta earnings and more big tech earnings, Microsoft, I believe, Coinbase, I want to say as well. So we have a few big names tomorrow as well. So I'm not expecting the market to do anything crazy, but in the morning, we do have ADP, non-farm payrolls, I believe, and a few other key events as well. So it's really tough for me to see possibly more upside. At max, you guys know my all-time high target is about 505. We could be looking at about 503, 505 on the triple Qs. Let's actually go and look at the triple Qs real quick. We could be looking at a move towards 503, 505, somewhere around that range. And we do have a little more space to the upside here within the supply and demand zone. And we're looking at about 503.6, pretty much right where these guys are right here. So this is something to pay attention to as well. So if we do head higher towards 505, 503, I think there's going to be some type of short-term sell-off, if not the actual market correction. There's just not much going on here. And we go down to the 4-hour time frame, and you see it here. We're starting to head towards overbought territory. So I just want to show you guys that we can get rid of this now, make a much clearer picture here. But looking at the daily time frame on the triple Qs, we zoom out, and we've been trading in within this channel for some time. We're bringing this channel back. We talked about this like some months ago, where we pretty much essentially caught the top here, and now we're back in this area all over again. So are we looking at another topping process? And I think it's given what's going to happen between this week and next week, I would say we're pretty close. I think we're looking at a buy the rumor, sell the news type event. I don't know how the market is going to react to whoever gets voted, but I do think that regardless, sometime next week, we're going to see some type of sell off, if not the end of this week, considering that we have those major earnings with Apple, Meta, Amazon, so on and so forth. So some big names that can potentially cause a sell off across the market. So that's what we're looking at in regards to the triple Qs. So In regards to triple Qs, as long as we stay above 500, I would say that we are pretty bullish. After 500, if we just so happen to break below 500 for whatever reason, then we're just pretty much looking at this gap fill at around 494, 494, 495, somewhere around that range. And then 490 is what you really want to see hold here. 490, we'll say 489 to be really safe. And so now that we're talking about the triple Qs, I want to show you guys just the options flow that's been coming in as well. And so we look at the triple Qs on unusual wells. Link is in the description below. But we look at the options flow for triple Qs, and there's just a massive amount of puts that just came in towards the end of the day. And ironic enough, those puts came in pretty much right. I mean, really close to the top. Granted, we still have a little more room, but those puts all just pretty much flooded the gates close to the top. We got it's a lot going on here. Hold on. So we got 485 puts for November 1st. We have 503 calls for November 1st as well. So we were talking about that potential target of 503, between 503 505. We have 495 puts, 487 puts, 504 calls for what is this to October 31st, so that's like 2 days from now. So very, very interesting. And then we have 518 calls as well. So that's something to think about as well. But I want to take the 518 calls seriously, and then you want to look at the premiums for these very, very high premiums, all over $1 million type premiums here. And then you just have a lot of bearish flow coming into a lot of these plays. Even the calls has a lot of bearish flow. And I can't necessarily show you guys that it's not all within the screen. I'm aware that you guys can't see that. But if you want to see it yourself, then Unusual Whales link is in the description below. But regardless, just a lot of puts just came in right before close. We could take it with a grain of salt. I mean, maybe they don't play out right away, but I just would be very cautious because all of these either expire within the next 2, 3 days or they expire next week. So something to really pay attention to here in regards to the triple Qs. A lot of bearish flow coming in. A lot of they have higher ask over bid, very high premiums. Is very, very, I would say be very careful heading into the next few days, especially considering that we have all these earnings coming in as well. So triple Qs is in a very, very interesting spot. NQ showing the same thing. And so we look at I want to look at Apple real quick because Apple does have earnings coming up as well. And so either Meta or Apple is going to cause a massive downside or a massive upside. We saw what happened last time Meta pretty much failed earnings. I don't know where all my drawings went, but regardless, we had Apple right here. We can just do this from scratch. We had Apple pretty much form an ascending triangle, right? And we talked about this in the last video where Apple is forming this ascending triangle. Now, what's important to note, or what's very interesting about Apple, is that it's constantly pushing out bad news. You have all this bad news in regards to iPhone sales, just constantly coming in regards to Apple. And so, if Apple just so happens to be earnings, this is a massive move, and we could be looking at a move all the way to about 250, 260 if we just so happen to break out of here. And in order to break out of here, we're looking at a move above 238, right above the supply and demand zone here. We're looking at a move above 238. So if you really want to play it safe, prior to earnings, you can watch Apple pretty much break above 238 if it does happen. Other than that, your best option is either sit on cash or you can just pretty much gamble on earnings because that's exactly what earnings is. It's a 50-50 gamble. But regardless, Apple pretty much looks good. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do get some type of massive sell off prior to Apple earnings. It would be really tough for me to see us just pump straight into Apple earnings. I guess we could see 510 into Apple earnings. It's just a matter of it's just the fact that we have Meta earnings and then we have Microsoft. We have these other names coming right before that. So really tough to say what's going to happen. But if there was to be a massive sell-off, I just wouldn't be surprised. And then just Apple holds its ground around this area because we've seen it before. We've seen the market pretty much either pump and the Apple just does the opposite, or the market dumps and Apple does the opposite again. So that's what we could be looking at. So this is a very interesting setup here. Ascending triangle. And considering that we're really close to the top of these supply and demand zones on the triple Qs and the NQ, and we're at the top of these rising wedge patterns, it's really interesting to see how Apple would play out. It could be a trap with all the bad news. It definitely could be. But right now, I have to say that things are looking pretty bullish for Apple. It's pretty much been holding its ground within this area. So we'll see closer to earnings. We might have to play that. Now, let's talk about Google here. Google ended up beating. So I was wrong about Google missing. Congratulations to Discord members. We actually we got into calls like the last minute on Google. We did like 177.5 calls, I believe. So hopefully this holds until morning. We do have a lot of news in the morning prior to open, so we're hoping that Google holds. It made its implied move. It does still have a little more room to about 182. So regardless, we just wanted to hold prior to that news. Well, not prior to market open, and then market open, we're just looking to take profit like right away. Okay, so I should have went for the 175 calls, but it is what it is. But you had this inverse head and shoulders pattern. My first thought process was that we just pretty much trap bulls here, and then we make another, well, not make another, but just make a deeper shoulder right here, and then we start to bounce up. And so ideally, I think Google is pretty much at open. I think Google is at the top. I genuinely think so. I think once market opens, because Google's like around this area. It's like at 179 point something after hours, right? I think Google's done here. I don't have my fair value gaps up, but it pretty much mitigated this. It was a fair value gap. We talked about this in the last video. There was a fair value gap in this area. And so I think from this point on, Google is going to start selling off between tomorrow and the rest of the week. I think you're going to start seeing Google really start to sell off because there is a fair value gap all the way into like 150s, 140s range that needs to be mitigated. And I think Google just pretty much got this out the way, this area out the way, and now it's going to head back down. So we'll see. I don't think Google has done for its earnings report. Yes, it beat. That's great, but it still doesn't have anything innovative for it to push higher, especially if we're talking about like 200s and things like that. So we'll see. But regardless, I think Google just pretty much topped for its earnings, hit that fair value gap, and I think we're going to start seeing some type of sell off. Even across the market, I think we're going to start eventually seeing some type of sell off. And I wouldn't be surprised if it happens prior to Apple, either prior to Apple earnings or around election time. So we'll see. But that's what I have for Google. And so let's talk about Meta. So Meta was reacting to Google news in regards to cloud news. So that's a very tall tale sign that Meta might actually miss for its earnings, especially considering that it's pumping prior to its earnings. Um, I told you guys in my last video that I thought Meta was going to beat, and I still possibly that still could be the case. Meta could still possibly beat for its earnings. It just needs to surprise for its earnings. But regardless, considering where Google is and just how Meta has reacted to Google's earnings and just how it just skipped like from 593 all the way to like the 600s, I have to assume that if we're talking about Google having a pretty much near its top, that Meta is going to end up selling off for its earnings. So we'll see. But it's all speculation right now. Again, take it with a grain of salt. Earnings is always 50-50. Do your due diligence. I'm just talking about earnings here. Okay, so take it with a grain of salt. But regardless, if Meta just so happens to pump or continue to pump higher, it can head towards the 630s. But there's right now it's like 605 after hours. So again, Meta has these gaps to the downside. It's in this rising channel right here. This is a bearish pattern. So again, if Meta sells off, then obviously Google's going to probably sell off for, well, not for earnings, but well, Meta's for its earnings. Man, I cannot talk today. So hopefully you guys get the idea. So I will really pay attention to Google at open, and then I will pay attention closer to close, just how if Google starts to sell off, I think that's a tall tale sign that Meta might just drop for its earnings, especially considering that Meta has majority of its fair value gaps to the downside. It has a gap right here. It has actually a lot of gaps to the downside. Now that I'm really looking at it, a lot of gaps. Has a gap here, has a gap here. There's a gap right here, and then there's a bunch of fair value gaps to the downside that need to be mitigated. So this is very interesting. If you do the math here, you'll kind of come to the conclusion that Meta might just miss, and that's the crazy part. Considering that I originally thought that Meta could beat, But now that it's pumping prior to its earnings, it's really tough to say. And if you don't know, Meta has earnings after hours tomorrow. So that's what I'm looking at in regards to Meta. It's in a very interesting spot. I would definitely watch and see if it continues to pump. If it continues to pump into its earnings, then I would probably start loading puts. I'll see what options flow says, but until then, I just think Meta's not looking too strong right now. We'll see. I won't say not too strong, but not looking too good for its earnings if it keeps pumping. And so that's what I have for Meta. And so we look at Nvidia. Nvidia is very lackluster. I'm very surprised. I thought if anything, Nvidia would probably pump today, and it just didn't move with the market at all. So it's very surprising, honestly. Nvidia needs to get above 143 in order to really like see some upside here. But regardless, you see it's below this rising wedge. Let's go to the 4-hour time frame here. It's below the rising wedge. There's not much to talk about here. It's below the rising wedge. I have a target of 137. If it gets below 140, it's still fighting between 140 and 143. Surprisingly, AMD's earnings didn't affect Nvidia. That's surprising. But what can you do? I mean, regardless. But right now, I think Nvidia can see 150. It's just how it's going to get there. I have no clue how it's going to get there, if at all. All right, so I don't have much for Nvidia. It's really in this weird spot until it either breaks above 143 or breaks below 140. There's not much to talk about here in regards to um, Nvidia. Let's go back to Google real quick. So another reason why I think Google is pretty much at its topping process, it's very, very overbought. It's been overbought all like yesterday it was overbought, and then today it's been overbought all day on the 4-hour time frame. So you see it right here. It's very overbought on RSI. If you want access to these indicators that I'm using, fair value gaps. A lot of people ask about like the fair value gaps indicators and things like that. Chart Prime description is in the description below. They have like hundreds of indicators. They custom make their indicators. They're like some of the best indicators in the game. Like seriously, um, in my opinion. All right, so check them out. I think it's well worth it. They have a lot of indicators to choose from to fit your style, to fit your trading style. So definitely check it out. But again, I think Google's near the topping, or pretty much at its topping process. And at open, I would definitely pay attention to see if Google starts selling off. And if it doesn't start selling off, and it just keeps climbing until close tomorrow, that says a lot about what's going to happen with Meta earnings. Do what you want with that information. But that's really all I have for this video. I mean, I guess we can look at IWM, and then we can look at Bitcoin, right? So IWM, IWM looks like it wants to drop. Like it just looks like it wants to drop. It's trying to drop, but the market is holding it up. I will say that if anything, IWM, if it hits about 224, 225, that's an excellent opportunity to get more puts. I say more puts because we're already in puts. We got into puts at around 225, so we're currently in profit and it scored. So yeah, IWM, I think this thing is ready to tank. It's just a matter of when the market is going to tank. So we'll see. Probably the ADP news tomorrow, GDP news tomorrow will probably help this thing make its decision. We'll see. And then we can look at Bitcoin. So I told you guys about Bitcoin at around, well, I gave you guys a target of 71,300. It pretty much hit that like almost right away after that video. Um, and now it's at the top of the supply and demand zone. It's pretty much rejected the top of the supply and demand zone at around 73, 74K. So yeah, very interesting. Coinbase has their earnings after hours tomorrow as well, so that's going to be very interesting. Again, I can't say for sure how Coinbase and Bitcoin are going to correlate with each other in regards to earnings. What I will say is that Bitcoin could be already like pricing in for Coinbase. I know there's a lot of news that came in for Bitcoin, whatever the case may be, but maybe Bitcoin is giving us a sign on potentially that, or a potential sign that Coinbase is going to do great for its earnings. We'll see. Um, that's really all I have for Bitcoin. It's just until it breaks above previous highs, there's nothing to talk about here. 74K, it needs to get above 74. We'll say 75K cycle level. 69K. As long as it's above 69K, this thing is pretty bullish. That's all I gotta say. If it breaks below 69K, then start packing your bags. You're going to the abyss, and yeah, your account's gone. But anyway, that's pretty much all I have for this video. I don't think there's any point in going over the SPY right now. Triple Qs, NQ has pretty much been running everything. ES has barely moved. SPY has barely moved. So we'll see. But that's all I have. If you have any agreements, let me know in the comments below. If you disagree, let me know in the comments below. Maybe I missed something. And yeah, till the next video, traders, have a good one.